Jeremy Clarkson boasts one of the longest and most successful careers in the UK's history, with his name synonymous with not just one, but multiple of the most groundbreaking shows ever recorded. Yet, as successful as he is, and despite being a household name throughout the world, he also often appears regularly on most hated celebrity lists. The reality is that as much as Clarkson's career is a map of unprecedented success, it's likewise a tapestry of controversy, criticism, and outrage. So much so that it's perhaps best to ask who he hasn't offended. From accusations of racism, sexism, and homophobia to headline-making scandals fraught with physical assault and violence. The fact that Clarkson has remained popular throughout this constitutes at least some kind of miracle. Now, we're not here today to bash Clarkson or to tell you how to feel about him, and we're not here to define the rules of British sense of humour or decide on the limitations of satire. We're simply here to navigate a career that is infamous for its scandals, and however you feel about Clarkson, by the end, is of course your opinion. If you know Jeremy Clarkson from anywhere, it's almost certainly from the global smash hit television show Top Gear. At the peak of its success, between 2007 and 2015, the show was being viewed by an absolutely gobsmacking global audience of 350 million on a weekly basis across 200 countries. To this day, Top Gear is still one of the most successful factual shows in history, managing to achieve the level of success while still essentially being about cars. The degree of success, given the circumstances, isn't just impressive, it's nothing short of unprecedented. And for context, Top Gear was arguably more popular than other smash hits like Friends and Seinfeld combined. As to why Top Gear was so successful, well, there's almost no question that it would never have done as well as it had were it not for the efforts of one man, Jeremy Clarkson. The original Top Gear aired on BBC Two between 1977 and 2001, finding moderate success with its focus on road safety, driver tips, coverage of various local events, and car reviews. Even before Clarkson joined in '88, the show had already been the target of minor criticism, with some accusing the presenters of encouraging irresponsible driving. The early complaints were, of course, nothing in comparison to the storms of outraged controversy that would come later, but we'll get to that. Prior to running Top Gear, Clarkson had run a company that wrote car reviews for various media outlets, with his unique approach being a kind of snarky, brutally honest persona that was more than a little unusual for the time. Top Gear took note of the reviews and signed him up, insisting that he bring the same brand of comedy to the show. And he obliged. From day one, his presence revolutionised Top Gear, resonating with UK audiences on a fundamental level. Here was a man that wasn't beating around the bush or being careful not to offend car manufacturers. He was saying what he really felt, and it was often hilarious. So, almost overnight, Clarkson went from being virtually unknown to a local celebrity, and his boorish, rude, and yet somehow still lovable brand was solidified. Top Gear began to soar in popularity, and there was no question that viewers were tuning in primarily to see what Clarkson would dare to say next. Naturally, the more viewers tuned in, the further Clarkson was encouraged to toe the line, and the more he leaned into being purposefully outrageous. A prime example is one of the earlier episodes in which he reviewed the Vauxhall Vectra, remarking, "I know it's the replacement for the Cavalier, I know, but I'm telling you, it's just a box on wheels." A rather tame insult in comparison to what came later, but this unapologetic approach drew in viewers by the millions, and it wasn't long before what had been a mildly successful show was peaking above 5 million weekly viewers. Seeing what was happening, the BBC scrambled to try and recreate the success elsewhere, launching the Cars, the Star, Driven Pulling Power, The Motor Show, and Vroom Vroom. Every spin-off failed to produce Top Gear numbers, and it was no secret as to why. They all lacked the magic, which was Clarkson himself. Top Gear continued on into the 90s, and Clarkson certainly ruffled some feathers along the way, namely those of a few major automotive manufacturers. For the most part, up until that point, his brand of humour was still largely viewed as good nature, and audiences acknowledged that everything he said should be taken with a pinch of salt. If anything, he was being celebrated for speaking his mind, as opposed to putting on a plastic TV personality, which was the BBC standard virtually everywhere else. Then came the real sign of what was on the horizon, occurring in 1998 at the Birmingham Motor Show. As Clarkson reviewed the Hyundai vehicles at the show, he remarked that the South Koreans had likely eaten dog, and that the Hyundai company designer had probably eaten a spaniel for lunch. Hyundai UK was, predictably, outraged, and PR manager Stephen Kitson was quick to call Clarkson's comments deliberately vindictive, unnecessary, and bigoted and racist. Most telling, according to Hyundai, is that Clarkson hadn't used similarly insulting stereotypes when reviewing the French vehicles, seeming to indicate that he had a problem with South Koreans in particular. A formal letter of complaint was sent to the BBC, but in this case the organisation did not offer an apology, nor did it demand that Clarkson apologise. Instead, the BBC simply stated that Clarkson's remarks were meant to be entertaining and were made with a twinkle in his eye. The matter was dropped, and if it wasn't already obvious, the BBC would be forced to make similar statements dozens of times in the coming years and would likewise keep having to reconsider what the limitations of comedy really were. Hyundai, on the other hand, ultimately decided to return fire, taking a humorous jab at Top Gear and Clarkson with their remarkably well-made Top Gear satire advert produced by Hyundai South Africa in 2010. It's unclear if it was the 1998 Hyundai incident that prompted Clarkson to leave Top Gear a year later, though his article in Top Gear magazine suggests that it was certainly part of the reason. In his own words, he stated that he wanted to pursue other opportunities, clarifying that he'd grown a bit bored of Top Gear's format and its obvious limitations. He jokingly added that he'd fallen asleep while driving a review car and felt that the show badly needed a change of direction. Whatever his reasons for quitting, his departure serendipitously gave him exactly what he wanted. His missing presence resulted in Top Gear viewer numbers plummeting, the show was cancelled soon after, and the way was paved for a new version of Top Gear, a version that would be sleeker, dramatically more bombastic, and exponentially more controversial. Top Gear was reborn in 2002 using a new format and was an overnight smash hit. Clarkson worked closely with executive producer Andy Wilman, and together the pair took everything they thought worked about the original series and then amplified it up to 1,000. This meant a focus on no-nonsense car reviews, only brief news segments presented with a comedic edge, and a boundary-pushing sense of humour that permeated throughout. Additional novelty aspects included the star in a reasonably priced car, which challenged a celebrity to race around a track to achieve a fastest time, and the character of the Stig, a test drive expert that remained anonymous as part of a running joke. Clarkson hosted, leaning into his edgy persona, joined by previous Top Gear member James May and newcomer Richard Hammond. The chemistry between the trio of the presenters was, above all else, a major part of the show's success, encouraging even those who weren't interested in cars to still tune in, just for the entertainment value. At this point, we should pause for a moment and make something very clear. We're going to get into some of the almost countless controversies of Top Gear, but as we do, it's important to keep something in mind. Top Gear was, from day one, scripted, and head writer Richard Porter is responsible for many of the jokes that caused outrage. There is a notion that Clarkson alone is responsible for the humour of Top Gear, but in reality, the show's producers and writers are arguably just as responsible. Clarkson has admitted in interviews that he was often part of the writing process and that he, the writers, and other presenters often wrote the show based on a principle of purposefully trying to upset BBC management. According to Clarkson, if he and his writing contributors felt that the BBC would be upset by a particular joke, to them, it meant that audiences would be delighted. We will also get to the failings of Clarkson on a personal level, but for now, let's talk about the cultural mockery and stereotyping that became synonymous with Clarkson and Top Gear. From the very beginning, the show was not shy about saying what others would avoid, focusing on the region currently being visited by the team. One of the earliest incidents and earliest controversies goes back to episode 2 of series 1, in which Clarkson remarked that the roads in Wales were perfect for test driving cars, given that they were empty since no one wants to live here. Labour AM's Alan Pugh made a complaint to the BBC regarding the remark, suggesting that Top Gear was encouraging speeding in Wales. On this occasion, the BBC was comfortable dismissing the complaint as nonsense, but it wouldn't be long before the apologies and justifications would become increasingly tense. Just 2 years later, in 2004, the first major incident unfolded, making clear for the first time that Clarkson couldn't always control his temper. While attending the British Press Awards, he punched Daily Mirror editor Piers Morgan 3 times in the head. Morgan left with a permanent scar, Clarkson with a broken finger, and the public was left gaping in disbelief. It turned out the physical altercation had been the culmination of a long-running feud between Clarkson and the Daily Mirror, with the publication having repeatedly published antagonistic photos of Clarkson against his express wishes. Photos in 2002 showed Clarkson with a woman other than his wife, and Clarkson had directly asked the Daily Mirror not to publish them. Piers Morgan went ahead regardless, and it was this decision that resulted in Clarkson throwing fists the first chance he got. Incidentally, as a rather significant side note, Morgan had received Newspaper Editor of the Year at the 2004 British Press Awards, only to be fired from the Daily Mirror just 2 months later, May of that same year. Morgan had given the green light for the Daily Mirror to publish alleged photos of British soldiers abusing Iraqi prisoners, only for a later investigation to reveal that the photos had been faked and were published as a calculated and malicious effort to capitalise on the very real prison abuse scandal that was playing out at the time. The Daily Mirror apologised unreservedly for the damage the photos caused the Queen's Lancashire Regiment and fired Morgan, who claimed he'd been given the photos in good faith. Clarkson and Morgan have since buried the hatchet, and Morgan even appeared in the most recent season of Clarkson's Farm. We'll get to Clarkson's other incident of physical violence in 2015, referred to as the Fracas, which is the scandal that brought about the end of Top Gear. Meanwhile, following on from the British Press Awards, Top Gear was rapidly escalating the antagonistic nature of its jokes, with another particularly controversial occurrence unfolding during the first episode of Series 7 in 2005. The segment featured a review of the BMW Mini presented during the Tokyo Motor Show, and as part of the evaluation, Hammond showcased a car that was quintessentially British. The joke was that the car featured only an integrated T-set, but set up a counter-gag in which Clarkson described a car that was quintessentially German. His description suggested that a German car should feature turn signals that displayed as Nazi salutes, a sat-nav that only goes to Poland, and ein Fanbelt that will last 1,000 years. That last reference, of course, to the Nazi slogan of the 1,000-Year Reich. The German government responded with outrage, and viewer complaints flooded into the BBC Board of Governors. In 2006, the BBC Governors Programme Complaints Committee gave their official response, saying, "The committee did not believe that, when looking at the audience as a whole, they would have felt that the comments were anything more than Jeremy Clarkson using outrageous behaviour to amuse his audience, and that the remarks would not have led to anyone entertaining new or different feelings or concerns about Germans or Germany." During that same year, in Top Gear magazine, Clarkson took a few direct jabs at the BBC, clearly sticking to the formula of purposefully annoying management. His article claimed that the BBC didn't take Top Gear seriously, made the show too long, and often replaced it with snooker coverage, despite Top Gear being dramatically more popular. In this case, Clarkson was just making a few wisecracks, or at least that's what the BBC ultimately decided. The organisation responded by saying that Clarkson's words are, quote, "an integral part of the programme and are not intended to be taken seriously. This is part of the appeal of the show, and we trust most viewers are familiar enough with the style and tone of the show not to take offence." Following the Germany incident was the even more controversial occurrence that played out when the team visited the US in 2007. In the first Top Gear US special, Series 9, Episode 3, the team conducted a road trip that took them from Alabama to Louisiana. During part of the trip, they made a deliberate attempt to upset locals, painting slogans on their cars which read, "NASCAR sucks," "Hillary for president," and "Man Love Rules OK." The result was, predictably, a heated altercation at a petrol station, with the crew coming under a barrage of verbal assault. The episode showed a hasty retreat, with rocks thrown at Top Gear cars as they sped off. Clarkson later said that there were only 2 moments in Top Gear history during which he felt genuine danger, and believed there was a real risk of him or someone in the crew getting seriously injured or possibly even killed. The altercation at the petrol station in Alabama is one, and the other is the 2014 Argentina incident that stands as one of the big 3 controversies in Top Gear history. They're all coming up shortly. For now though, in the case of the Alabama incident, enormous criticism was levelled at not just the deliberate attempt to provoke violence, but the obvious risk that the crew were putting themselves in. In reality, while the altercation at the petrol station was genuine and indeed very tense, the dramatic nature of the escape was exaggerated for television purposes. Next up is the first of the big 3 Top Gear scandals, and the clearest early sign that the tone of the show was no longer being seen as good-natured, at least not by multi-million-dollar corporations that could potentially suffer serious financial losses. This was also one of the few times that the show had to deal with a major lawsuit, and it wouldn't be the last. Episode 7 of Series 12, broadcast in 2008, and more often simply referred to as the Tesla episode, saw Clarkson reviewing the Tesla Roadster. In a similar way to how he roasted most vehicles, Clarkson claimed that the Tesla's batteries were flat after 88.5 kilometres, remarking that the recharge would take 16 hours. It was then shown that the car had broken down and had to be pushed into a shed. Tesla Motors was not amused at having been present for the audience tests, and came forward to insist that the car's battery had never dropped below 20% and that a recharge would take just a few hours, and that the only technical malfunction had been a simple blown fuse. The BBC responded saying, quote, "The tested Tesla was filmed being pushed into the shed in order to show what would happen if the Roadster had run out of charge. Top Gear stands by the findings in this film and is content that it offers a fair representation of the Tesla performance on the day it was tested. A BBC spokeswoman later repeated in an interview several times that, quote, Top Gear is an entertainment programme and should not be taken seriously. Regardless, Tesla CEO Elon Musk filed a lawsuit against the BBC for libel. The matter was thrown out in October 2011, with Justice Tugendhat saying that no Top Gear viewer would have reasonably compared the cast performance on the show's airfield track to its likely performance on a public road. The Romania episode came next, episode 1 of series 14 in 2009, and a few things were starting to become evident. Clarkson and the show were clearly feeling the pressure to keep pushing boundaries and were increasingly relying on offensive jokes to maintain the reputation of Top Gear as a controversy hotbed. In this case, the jokes resulted in a cyber attack that shook the BBC to its core, and the patience of BBC higher-ups was now starting to wear thin. In the episode, the presenters took a road trip to Romania, and as expected, Clarkson took a dig at local culture. He referred to Romania as Borat country, populated by gypsies and Russian playboys, a reference to the 2006 Sacha Baron Cohen mockumentary about a fictional Kazakhstani journalist. The film itself had been a major scandal, culminating in multiple attempts to sue 20th Century Fox, and Top Gear kept the ball rolling by stoking additional outrage. The mockery continued, with Clarkson wearing a pork pie hat, which he referred to as a gypsy hat, commenting, I'm wearing this hat so the gypsies think I am another gypsy. The initial response came from the Romanian ambassador, Dr. Ion Ginger, who took a commendably diplomatic approach. He sent a letter to Top Gear producers saying that he appreciated the show and celebrated freedom of expression, but also offered a breakdown of the ethnic population of Romania in an effort to contextualise what the term gypsy actually meant. Dr. Ginger additionally asked that the episode be edited to remove the comments he found offensive, and in this case, the episode was indeed later edited to remove mentions of the film Borat and the comments that referenced gypsies. Before the edits had been finalised, the Daily Telegraph was hacked by a group of Romanians who declared, "We're sick of being misrepresented as gypsies, and thanks to Top Gear, have been publicly insulted." 2 pages of the Daily Telegraph were hijacked and flooded with Romanian flags and the song Lonely Shepherd by George Samthir. Some may have taken the cyber attack as a sign that things were going too far, but on the contrary, Clarkson and the Top Gear team only pushed things further, obliged to keep the show fresh and the viewer numbers peaking. So inevitably, the big controversy came just 2 years later during the India special, episode 7 of series 17 in 2011. The material deemed offensive was a running series of gags in which it was repeatedly suggested that the food in India is likely to give visitors serious diarrhea. One joke in particular saw Clarkson build a toilet into the back of his Jaguar, suggesting that it was an essential part of visiting the country. The Indian High Commission didn't see the humour and filed a complaint saying that it found the content disgusting, that the jokes were running down on Indian society, and that overall the Commission did not approve of Top Gear's toilet humour. The BBC, once again, responding in the way it had long been accustomed, insisted that the jokes were not to be taken seriously. With that, we now come to what many think of as the beginning of the end of Top Gear, the other 2 major controversies that clearly indicated Clarkson and show were crossing a line. The international community was no longer willing to shrug off what it felt was seriously offensive, and there's no better example of this than the Mexico and Argentina episodes. These were the incidents that paved the way for the ultimate downfall of the Top Gear golden era, though it wouldn't be until Clarkson punched a producer that the guillotine finally dropped in earnest. Starting with the Mexico incident, the second episode of series 16 in 2013, the episode focused on a review of the Mistretta MXT, a sports car designed in Mexico. The car was introduced as the Tortilla, and Hammond explained that cars reflect national characteristics. A Mexican car is just going to be a lazy, feckless, flatulent oaf with a moustache, leaning against a fence asleep, looking at a cactus with a blanket with a hole in the middle on as a coat. I'm sorry, but just imagine waking up and remembering you're Mexican. Clarkson followed up by saying, "It would be brilliant because you could just go straight back to sleep again." Later, in what was clearly a very deliberate attempt to provoke the Mexican ambassador to Britain, Clarkson suggested that Eduardo Medina Mora would be too lazy to make any kind of complaint. Mora, of course, promptly did make a complaint, saying that the presenters of the programme resorted to outrageous, vulgar, and inexcusable insults to stir bigoted feelings against the Mexican people, their culture, as well as their official representative in the United Kingdom. These offensive, xenophobic and humiliating remarks only serve to reinforce negative stereotypes and perpetuate prejudice against Mexico and its people. The BBC, again, took the stance of defending the joke, saying that national stereotyping was a part of British humour, but apologised to the Mexican ambassador for the remarks made about him personally. The broadcast regulator Ofcom also cleared the episode, saying, in this case, Ofcom took into account that Top Gear is well known for its irreverent style and sometimes outspoken humour, as well as the regular format of the studio banter between the three presenters. We considered that viewers of Top Gear were likely to be aware that the programme frequently uses national stereotypes as a comedic trope, and that there were few, if any, nationalities that had not at some point been the subject of the presenter's mockery throughout the history of this long-running programme. For example, this same episode featured a competition between the UK's Top Gear presenters and their Australian counterparts, throughout which the Australians were ridiculed for various national traits. Despite the episode once again being cleared, exhaustion with the show and the constant need to make apologies and justifications was spreading beyond the BBC. BAFTA award winner Steve Coogan publicly came forward to express his growing disdain, saying that apologies for Top Gear are starting to appear pitiful, adding that the insults had gone too far, and that using the defence that the jokes were just for a laugh was no longer acceptable. It's worth noting that even as Coogan was expressing his outrage, Mexican sports car designer Mastretta openly declared it had no complaints. The company simply shrugged off the controversy, and General Director Carlos Mastretta clarified that he felt his car had simply been a pretext for jokes, adding that the humour had succeeded in doing what he aimed for, increasing interest in the MXT. With Top Gear having dodged yet another bullet, we now arrive at what was the show's biggest scandal, and the last major incident before the firing of Clarkson and the ultimate collapse of Top Gear. The Patagonia special saw the team driving from Chile to Argentina, and to say that things got out of control is a serious understatement. The presenters and crew declared that they were without a doubt in real danger, with this being the other incident during which Clarkson genuinely feared for his life. Though unlike what occurred in Alabama, in this case, nothing was edited to increase the thrill. The presenters and crew really did have to flee the country. The catalyst for the drama was, bizarrely, a license plate on one of the vehicles, specifically one that read H982 FKL. Locals saw the license plate as a reference to the 1982 Falklands War, which, if you're unfamiliar, was a major conflict that played out between Argentina and the UK. The Argentine military junta invaded the Falkland Islands, which were, and still are, a British overseas territory. The Argentine invasion was repelled in a battle that cost 900 lives, and the defeat resulted in the downfall of the Argentine junta and President Leopoldo Galtieri. The bottom line is that the perceived reference to the war was nothing short of a slap in the face to the veterans, and things predictably turned hostile. The hotel where the team was staying was stormed by angry protesters, and according to Clarkson, he hid under a bed for fear of violence. He later posted, Top Gear production purchased 3 cars for a forthcoming programme, to suggest that this car was either chosen for its number plate or that an alternative number plate was substituted for the original is completely untrue. For once, we did nothing wrong. H982 FKL has been registered to the Porsche since its manufacture in May 1991. No violence occurred during the storming of the hotel, but the local police made it clear they would not and could not offer any assistance. With tensions high, the presenters were sent ahead and were flown to Buenos Aires. The crew's equipment had to be taken over the border to Chile, which was successful, though the vehicles were left abandoned and were later found to have been pelted with rocks. In October 2014, Argentine ambassador Alicia Castro met BBC director of television Danny Cohen to demand an official apology. The BBC refused to apologise, broadcasting the entire episode uncut as a special on the 27th and 28th of December 2014. An investigation was later launched into the incident in May 2015, and the BBC Trust ruled that the licence plate had indeed not been deliberately chosen for the sake of outrage. To this day, no apology has been issued to the Argentine ambassador, and it remains a sore point that has never fully been ironed out. Meanwhile, even as the incident was playing out and an investigation was still underway, Clarkson had already been suspended, and the BBC had declared it had no intention of renewing his contract. Top Gear was officially over, though it wasn't actually the Argentina debacle that had been the last straw. It had rather been the actions of Clarkson himself. He had finally confirmed that the BBC did, in fact, have a limit, and he had gone beyond that limit. So, in the end, it wasn't Top Gear's constant need to reach ever higher levels of boundary-pushing humour that were the downfall, but rather the actions of its most celebrated presenter. Jeremy Clarkson's time as a Top Gear superstar came to its final, some would say inevitable conclusion, in March 2015. The BBC had been forced to defend Top Gear, and by extension Clarkson, for over a decade, but rumours suggested that the organisation had been keen on distancing itself from him for years prior. According to various sources and widespread speculation, the BBC had just been waiting for a justification to finally fire him, and he'd given it to them with the Fracas. The final warning had already come in May 2014, revolving around a Top Gear outtake that had never been aired and was never supposed to be publicly seen. In the clip, Clarkson mumbles the nursery rhyme, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," appearing to slip in a racial slur. He was clearly attempting to be entertaining, not directing the slur at anyone in particular, and it isn't even clear he actually used the offensive word at all, but the BBC was clearly at the end of its tether, especially given that Clarkson's old nemesis, the Daily Mirror, had got hold of the clip and made it public. So enraged were the BBC that they hired a forensic expert to determine if the offensive word had actually been said, and the result came back as inconclusive. Regardless, the incident was deemed as so serious that it issued him a final warning, declaring that if Clarkson made one more offensive remark anywhere, at any time, he would be fired. In response to this, in a weekly column he wrote for The Sun, Clarkson clarified the situation, saying, "Even the angel Gabriel would struggle to survive with that hanging over his head," adding, "It's inevitable that one day someone somewhere will say that I've offended them, and that will be that." He also insisted that he never used the offensive word, and that while the F word and C word are part of his lexicon, especially when talking to his fellow presenters, the N word isn't. He went on to criticise the BBC for insisting he make an apology video, since he felt he was not guilty of what he'd been accused of, and so, in his opinion, it was like apologising for starting the war in Syria. Even still, he released a video asking for forgiveness, though it would only stave off his ultimate dismissal for a few months. The incident that finally sealed his fate, the Fracas, came in 2015. In a now widely publicised incident, it's reported that Clarkson verbally assaulted and punched producer Oysin Timon, allegedly in a confrontation over the kitchen being closed after a long day of shooting, and Clarkson being left unable to get a hot meal. Whatever may or may not have been the context of the fight, the BBC had finally had enough, and apparently the massive success of Top Gear no longer outweighed the trouble that the show or Clarkson caused. The BBC announced that they had suspended Clarkson and would not be renewing his contract. The lawsuit that followed was settled for an unknown amount, understood to be in excess of £100,000, and Clarkson was apologetic, making the statement, "I would like to say sorry once again to Oysin Timon for the incident and its regrettable aftermath. I want to reiterate that none of this was in any way his fault. I would also like to make it clear that the abuse he has suffered since the incident is unwarranted, and I am sorry too that he has to go through that. I am pleased that this matter is now resolved. Oysin was always a creatively exciting part of Top Gear, and I wish him every success with his future projects." The abuse Clarkson was referring to was the open attacks Timon had suffered on social media, with fans of Clarkson and the show coming to the conclusion that the incident must have somehow been the producer's fault. There's nothing to suggest that this is true, and Clarkson himself has repeatedly made it clear that he wasn't in the wrong, and could have done nothing to resolve the disagreement. Regardless of who was or wasn't to blame, Top Gear fans were quick to declare their support for Clarkson, producing a petition of 1 million signatures demanding his reinstatement to Top Gear. The petition was ignored, BBC stood firm, and Clarkson was dismissed. It has, once again, been widely speculated that the BBC had been eager to get rid of Clarkson for years, and were secretly hoping to continue the show with someone substituting Clarkson on Top Gear, holding on to James May and Richard Hammond. If that was the plan, it failed outright, given that May and Hammond handed in their own resignations in support of Clarkson. Commenting later on the downfall of Top Gear, James May said, quote, "I thought it was very unfortunate, and I don't actually think our Top Gear had to end because of it. I think it could have been patched up and put down to a bit of high stress and flightiness, to be honest. It happened, it's regrettable and it's unfortunate, but it didn't need to lead to the collapse of something very successful. Maybe these things are ordained, and it was time for us to move on. We'd been doing it by then for a decade, I think, more, and I never imagined it would last as long. I went into it from magazine journalism, and I thought it would be a good laugh, probably for a couple of years." Richard Hammond, meanwhile, chose to stay mostly silent about the incident, declaring that he felt anything he said could be misinterpreted. Regardless, he chose to follow the trio on their new move to Amazon. Top Gear, meanwhile, would return briefly in 2016, featuring Chris Evans, Matt LeBlanc, Chris Harris, and Rory Reid, but the reboot failed to meet the level of previous success, ending in 2019. The next attempt to resurrect Top Gear came in 2019 and 2022, and again did not manage to match the success of the golden era. Clarkson, Hammond, and May, on the other hand, barely missed a beat, being signed up almost immediately by Amazon. The Grand Tour, a very similar show to Top Gear, more or less picked up right where they'd left off, and in this case, Amazon was willing to allow similarly offensive humour that had been so controversial on the BBC, even if it was notably toned down. The shift in tone seemed to suggest that Clarkson and his fellow presenters had learned their lesson, but it's more likely that Amazon had a few stipulations and was clear about not drawing too much heat from an endless parade of offended parties. This isn't to say that the Grand Tour was without controversy, though the levels of backlash were significantly less, probably in part due to the Grand Tour achieving lower viewer numbers, even if the show was still considered a massive success. Various jokes drew complaints for being deemed racist and homophobic, with a particular joke in Season 3, Episode 3, drawing criticism from singer Will Young. The joke in question was that the Jeep Wrangler was popular with the gay community, which Young claimed promoted gay stereotypes. All in all, the Grand Tour, run from 2016 until fairly recently, September 2024, comprising 46 episodes in total. As to why it came to an end, that brings us to perhaps the biggest and most far-reaching controversy of Clarkson's career. At this point, we've only briefly mentioned Clarkson's writing for various media outlets. In particular, his The Sun column, which he started in 1996 and still writes to this very day. He's known for using his columns as a direct means by which to voice his opinions on a variety of issues, and on more than one occasion, the words have managed to draw as much controversy as Top Gear itself. What's significant is that we previously suggested he arguably can't be held personally responsible for jokes made on Top Gear, given that he was part of a team, but in this case, he absolutely is responsible for everything said in his columns. We don't have time to cover every provocative column he's ever written, given that there are hundreds, so let's just focus on December 2022. The article published was an outright attack on Meghan Markle, wife of Harold Markle, otherwise known as Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, son of King Charles III, and Diana, Princess of Wales. The column was titled, "One Day Harold the Glove Puppet Will Tell the Truth About a Woman Talking B***." And in it, Clarkson was heavily critical of Meghan, viewing her as manipulative, attention-starved, and desperate to be a celebrity. He declared that she was using her husband as a hand puppet, manipulating him into certain political views with promises of bedroom favours. The lines that drew the most ire were Clarkson's declaration that he hated her on a cellular level. "At night, I'm unable to sleep as I lie there, grinding my teeth and dreaming of the day when she's made to parade through the streets of every town in Britain while the crowds chant shame and throw lumps of excrement at her. What makes me despair is that younger people, especially girls, think she's pretty cool." The paraded through the streets remark was obviously a reference to a scene in Game of Thrones where the manipulative Kirsty is subjected to the described punishment. Incidentally, the equally as controversial show South Park likewise did an episode focusing on the royal couple, depicting them as a self-obsessed pair that insisted they wanted privacy, even as they did everything in their power to draw as much attention as possible. The South Park episode drew significantly less criticism, likely because the show is incredibly well written and far smarter in its satire. Clarkson, meanwhile, had not so much written satire as he just hurled insults, at least according to the Independent Press Standards Organisation. The IPSO received a record 25,000 complaints about the article and was pulled just 24 hours after being published. IPSO chairman Lord Foulkes declared that the imagery was humiliating and degrading towards the Duchess, while Harry and Meghan accused Clarkson of promoting hate rhetoric, also alleging that he was spreading dangerous conspiracy theories and misogyny. The Sun issued an apology and admitted that it had fallen short of its high editorial standards, but followed up by saying it had not breached the editor's code and that the concerns were a matter of taste and judgment. The IPSO disagreed, though did dismiss further allegations that the article was in any way discriminatory on the grounds of race, inaccuracy, or sought to harass the Duchess. The findings were published in The Sun, with assurances that the IPSO had conducted a fair, independent, impartial and thorough investigation. Clarkson tweeted his apology, which read, "Oh dear, I've rather put my foot in it. In an article I wrote about Meghan, I made a clumsy reference to a scene in Game of Thrones, and this has gone down badly with a great many people. I'm horrified to have caused so much hurt, and I shall be more careful in the future." Regardless of whether his apology was sincere or not, the consequences were far-reaching. Apart from the Grand Tour, Clarkson had also been the host of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and had kicked off another successful show, Clarkson's Farm. Amazon declared that the Grand Tour would be coming to an end and that they were unlikely to renew his contracts for Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and Clarkson's Farm. At this point, you probably have some opinions about Clarkson and likewise opinions on what is or isn't the limit of satirical humour. It goes without saying that he is a very controversial figure and there's no question that not everyone finds his brand of humour funny. On the other hand, there's more to be said, and another part of Clarkson's story is, whether you like him or not, that he made incredible contributions to the UK and world at large. We already briefly mentioned his show Clarkson's Farm, which is amongst the most universally praised Amazon UK series, and for good reason. As it turns out, Clarkson can be an overwhelmingly positive force, at least when he chooses to be. Releasing on Amazon in 2021, the show Clarkson's Farm immediately took the public by surprise. The premise is that Clarkson declares he's going to start his own farm and will document the journey as it happens without bias or favour of any kind. Which is to say, unlike Top Gear and the Grand Tour, Clarkson's Farm is not scripted, and the public was astonished that the loudmouthed and flippantly offensive Clarkson everyone expected was gone, replaced instead by a seemingly vulnerable, humble and caring man. The argument can be made that Clarkson's Farm is simply an attempt to repair a fractured public image, but it's also possible that when not reading from a script and when not writing columns for clicks, he's no longer beholden to his brand and so appears more human than he ever has before. Starring alongside Clarkson is Caleb Cooper, a young farmer who was once unknown but has now become a minor celebrity in his own right. Cooper is not a comedic actor, instead appearing in the show as a straight-talking, no-nonsense mentor who responds naturally to Clarkson's clueless antics. Now, the show is not just popular for portraying Clarkson in a new light, it's also gained widespread praise for drawing attention to a reality that is often overlooked, and that is that the agricultural industry, in the UK and globally, is a nightmare. The show demonstrates that farmers are working in incredibly difficult circumstances, often earning a less than 1% return while still being forced to deal with unpredictable weather and to navigate poorly thought out regulations and suffocating bureaucracy. A particular incident that unfolded recently in 2025 saw Clarkson forced to cull a pregnant cow, the first that had been born in his farm and which had been pregnant with 2 unborn calves at the time. His farm, built from the ground up and jokingly referred to as Diddley Squat, had been hit by a devastating bovine tuberculosis outbreak, and in line with regulations, the entire property had been locked down until all infected cows had been systematically culled. According to Clarkson, the situation had been emotionally devastating, and he later insisted that the government had handled the situation in a haphazard way, stating, "I have no trust in the TB testing system at all. As a newcomer to farming, I find it all extremely haphazard. I also can't understand why no vaccine has been developed, and I do not see why a cow's unborn calves can't be delivered before the mother is killed." Apart from drawing attention to the hardships faced by farmers, Clarkson has also done a great deal to drum up support for the local agricultural industry. As part of his show, he set up the Diddley Squat Farm Shop, and as a direct result, similar farming outlets across the country received unprecedented levels of news support. Beyond this, the impact of the show has been so far-reaching and so significant that student applications for farming have skyrocketed, turning around what was a severe lack of interest in UK farming in general. Needless to say, public respect for Clarkson has skyrocketed, particularly in the global agricultural industry, with some going so far as to say that his show and the efforts he's made on behalf of farming are nothing short of revolutionary. As far as Clarkson's future is concerned, despite the trail of controversy he tends to leave in his wake, there's no sign that he's going to be slowing down anytime soon. You'll recall that Amazon were threatening to cancel his contracts following the Meghan Markle scandal, but it has, at least for the moment, been confirmed that Clarkson's Farm is getting a 6th season, and that Clarkson will again return to host Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Amazon's about turn in this regard isn't really too surprising, given that regardless of how much negative publicity is stirred up, Clarkson is still able to exceed all expectations. Clarkson's Farm regularly boasts an average 5 million views per episode, making it hands down Amazon's biggest success behind the Grand Tour. As far as Clarkson being a target for hatred is concerned, there are those that will argue that the undeniable positive impact of Clarkson's Farm doesn't excuse his previous scandals, and we're not here to agree or disagree one way or the other. There are also those, on the other hand, that say that Clarkson's Farm is the first real representation of Clarkson as a person, and that Top Gear and his columns always relied on him being controversial and bombastic as part of a brand. Whatever the case, as much as some outright hate him, and as much as he can stir up scandal like no one else, Clarkson has been, and still is, a bona fide hero in the eyes of farmers.